very much, Mwehaki. And I think a wonderful discussion we're about to have with 4 exciting panelists. But before we begin, let me just make a comment on something that you've flagged for us there, Mwehaki, which is that for the first time, this very prestigious award, the Pritzker Prize, has gone to an African architect. I saw this announcement on the New York Times, but the headline said, Pritzker Prize goes to architect from West Africa. They did not name the name in the headline. And actually, I felt quite offended. I thought that if this had been Norman Foster or any of the other so-called big names, that would have been in the headline. But Francis Carey then gets buried in the actual body of the article itself. So this is a wonderful opportunity to actually have a conversation around people who I think are shaping and changing things in the built environment. And of course, we're now going to talk about cultural heritage and the built environment. The built environment, I think, as we all know, is really around the buildings, the spaces, the settlements that are human-made. And I'm going to say human-made very deliberately, because in Africa, some of these spaces are made by women as well. So not man-made, but human-made. And we're going to look at, I think, 3 different areas. One is the education around built environment. We're also then going to look at the heritage that we have across Africa that talks to built environments. And then we're going to look at contemporary practices and how these are grappling with the questions of the colonial as we try to create new cities. So let me introduce the panelists. We have, and I will start in the order in which that they will be presenting. We have Dr. Romanus Opiyo, who is a lecturer at the University of Nairobi and also a research fellow with the Stockholm Environment Institute. Karibu sana, Dr. Opiyo.
Thank you, Jay.
We then have George Arrabu, who is an architect. He's also a member of the Architectural Association of Kenya and is actually a chapter chairperson with the association. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
And then we have Stella Mutegi and Kabage Karanja, who are both principals with Cave Bureau, a very exciting firm of architects and researchers who try to address the challenges of contemporary and rural urban lives by looking back deeply at this question of the context from which these spaces emerge, which is post-colonial. And so I think that across these 3 sets of panelists, so Cave Bureau, UON, or academia, and the practice, Architectural Association of Kenya as well, I think we're going to engage in some interesting ideas around how do we move forward with this question of cultural heritage and the built environment. We'll start with Dr. Opiyo. Dr. Opiyo, I know that, as Dr. Nyairo indicated in the beginning, and she spent quite a bit of time on this, that the way that we educate or are educated, of course, informs what we bring to practice. And I know that when we are looking at curricula, this informs then questions of policy and standards that those who you teach bring into practice. And then, of course, those who you teach bring into practice decide whether we are perpetuating post-colonial, colonial epistemes, colonial knowledge, or whether indeed they're given a chance to forge new thinking and create new directions for how we build cities. So we're looking forward to your reflection on the built environment curricula and how these shape thinking for the built environment. And without much further ado, I will invite you to spend some time on giving us that reflection. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thanks, Joy, for that elaborate introduction. Yeah, maybe as they load my slide, just to give an overview in terms of knowledge generation, because when we impart knowledge for built environment professionals, and in this case, when I talk about built environment professionals, here I refer to architects, planners, real estate experts, quantity surveyors, and others. Yeah. So when we give them knowledge, we expect them to embrace that knowledge in terms of how they first internalize it and how this is reflected in their practice. So in terms of my intervention to what Joy has highlighted, I'm looking at the academic, the curriculum in terms of how is it shaping the built environment, especially looking at from the pre-colonial up to now. And maybe I think the first question maybe you need to ask ourselves, before coming of what we know as modern knowledge. How was our built environment looking like? In terms of what was informing what we are seeing in our built environment, in terms of our settlements, in terms of the design of our houses, also in terms of our values, in terms of where we live. Because when you look at the built environment, you don't only look at settlements per se, but you look at the functions of this particular settlement. Yeah? Because when you look at the settlement, you look at the safety, if you're inside the house or within a community, how safe do you feel? So, given these particular principles in terms of what will make mankind to be comfortable, how has interaction with the modern culture, the modern ways of living, modern systems, modern practices, and even values, how has it shaped this over time? And if you look at this, ladies and gentlemen, you'll find that we have a lot of, we have a lot of, you have a lot of influence in terms of what has changed, in terms of our value system, and in terms of how the shapes, the living environment is changing over time. Yeah. So from the planning, because an urban planner, planners will deal with land use planning in terms of how do you, for example, plan for an entire city. Yeah. How do you go about planning for the entire city? And there are certain principles which we look at. And if you look at, I'll highlight them, then try to compare with traditional in terms of what kind of thinking was shaping our settlements. Yeah? One thing which is important when you undertake any planning exercise, which shapes even the mind of an architecture, is the public interest. Yeah? You must take into account the public in the use of that particular place. What is the public interest associated with that new settlement? Yeah? Be it a city, be it a market center, be it an urban area, be it a rural settlement. Yeah? The second thing which you need to take into account is the functionality. Okay? So how does it function? Because you can give space. Space is supposed to help us meet certain functions. Okay? Another aspect which also shapes our living environment is the sanitation or cleanliness. Okay? So because if you look traditionally, certain kind of hygienic conditions were associated with certain diseases. So when we are providing these particular settlements, you have to look at how the sanitation also help us to shape our settlement. Another issue which is very common, and if you look at even the Roman Empire, is the issue of security. Yeah, safety and security. So how safe is that particular environment? So if you look at these principles which informs how we evolve spirit, those are just few of them, and compare traditionally in terms of our concerns when we are making this particular space, you find that issue of safety and security was a major concern. And that's why you had communities living together, okay, so that they can be able to, with numbers, they are able to secure themselves in terms of security. Another issue which we need to also to look at, reflect in terms of cultural heritage, is the issue of functionality, okay? So you find even the homestead, it was organized in a certain logical manner. You find the main home for the household head, and the other dingira for the members of the family. There's a logical concentration. And maybe I reflect on the Luo culture. If you look at the homestead, we have the owner of the home, the main house facing the gate, and then around the gate you have the sons who are supposed to provide security to the old man, and the old man was supposed to give alarm. So there was certain logic in terms of how those spaces are organized. So if you look at the modern settlement pattern and architecture, there are certain functions or principles which you've borrowed and actually is influencing how we are shaping our settlements. Yeah? But another thing which has shaped the way we teach and also how we influence curriculum is the issue of policies and standards. Yeah. Before we used our local standards, which we didn't have, I can say a standard way of benchmarking in terms of the functionality, in terms of safety and others. Yeah? But currently, we have a lot of concerns in terms of standards. And if you look at the theoretical orientation of this, yeah, of looking at the neighborhood culture, because we have the neighborhood concept, which was supposed to enhance that interaction at the neighborhood level. And also, it was supposed also to reduce unnecessary movement so that you can get most basic things within your neighborhood. Yeah? And if you link that with the current orientation of planning and design of our cities, because now we are moving towards transit-oriented development, which is actually neighborhood, which is compact development. Yeah? Because transit-oriented development assumes that everything you can do within a walking distance. So this reduces the demand for motorized transport. Yeah? So if you look at that and traditional neighborhood concept, actually there are certain much, actually we are going back to the culture in terms of how we need to organize our space so that we can reduce the demand for that. So there are various theoretical thinking which has shaped this, which has also influencing how we do the curriculum. And secondly, we cannot also ignore the role of government and other players in terms of helping us to shape our living spaces. Yeah, I know for those of you who have been in Nairobi for some time, yeah, area like Kilimani, Kileleshwa, and others, there were one family unit dwelling units. Yeah, one family dwelling units. Yeah, we found a half an acre and 1 acre, somebody just one family. But due to need to expand housing because of the housing demand, now we have the same space having around 30, because we have apartments. The same space housing 30 whatever, 30 families. Yeah. So from one unit to multi-dwellings, yeah, for different families. So this particular thing, do we see we are going to also to maintain our culture? Because we are saying we are bringing more people in a small space, yeah? And looking at the older culture, our traditional culture, that we used to have space where people were living communally. By coming up with apartments, we are going to achieve this. So these are some of the things which you need to look at, even as planners, as architects, as built environment, and even as users of this particular space. Yeah? But just because some studies have been done about the kind of connection, social capital within these particular spaces, yeah? Where we have changed the zoning regulations to have multi-family dwelling in a previously single-family dwelling. We've seen that most of the neighbors, even they don't know each other. There's no social capital. Even people don't borrow salt from each other. Yeah? At times you're attacked in the house and your neighbor is even fearful to help you. Because we are saying that this one is not creating that uniformity, that cohesiveness. Actually, it's creating anonymity in the urban setup. And this is a major concern, because most of the studies have shown that bringing more people, because we are bringing more eyes, you are bringing more security. But what we are seeing in most of our cities is that more people are creating anonymity, where nobody cares. So numbers is not security the way it used to be, the way it used to be traditionally, where you have more people and bringing more security. So those are some of the thinking which is shaping our spaces here. So I think maybe on conclusion on the question, I think for the curriculum, there are two things which I think we need to factor. First is the focus of the curriculum. What is the main driver of the curriculum? Because curriculum is a living document. Yeah? It keeps on changing based on the demands and the needs of the society. So first, we need to see where did we go wrong? What kind of cultural aspect we need to factor in our curriculum when we are providing these built environment spaces. Secondly, we need also to balance, because we are living in a global village. So we need to look at what are kind of progressive culture which you can use to inform our curriculum so that we are able to meet our immediate needs, but also within the global confines, because we are signatory of global whatever in terms of SDGs and others. So how do we ensure that we are also careful that we meet our basic needs, but also within the parameters, because these architects, planners, we tend not just to practice in Kenya, but globally, so that they can fit and compete with other professionals globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Opiyo. I know that the time is very short for us to really probe the question of curricula, but maybe I can then just, in order to sort of interrogate that further, ask some of your young co-panelists who are architects themselves and of course have gone through a program of training to respond to the question of curricula. And I'll put this question to Kabage and to Stella. You're young, you're much younger than I am, and I know recent architects, exciting people who are working in the Nairobi space and trying to change our built environment with some really very powerful ideas. When you reflect back on your own education in training for practice, and listening to what Dr. Opiyo has said, where are the gaps and what are the things that you've begun to fill in that you think curricula should begin to pay attention to now? I think one of the things that you've mentioned is, what do we do with a more complex society, which is the city? That built environment, that settlement that is a city, is a complex society that includes many small nations and sub-nations that have many different ways had many different traditional ways of organizing themselves in the built environment. How does this begin to reflect itself in a city? But in particular, looking at curricula, what did you find, or what do you think are now gaps on reflection on your own education that you think can be brought into curricula today? Kabage, I'll ask you to respond to that first, and then Stella.
Thank you, Joy. It's a tough question, but I think reflecting on my own education and looking at gaps coming into practice here, for example, in Kenya, where I was trained in the United Kingdom, for example, I think it touches really on the decolonial narrative and looking at how much was missing in what we were being taught to do the history of architecture, to do the history of where we are today and how we find ourselves. And being a former settler, should we say, colonizer, the British, as Dr. Joy mentioned, Nyiro, sorry, she highlighted the fact that these histories are completely being erased from curricula. And reflecting on the past is critical in any education system. And so for us, I think in Cave Bureau, that's one of the key focuses, to claw back and look at the history that really, in a way, has been lost or more so hidden from us. And I think by looking back, it's a critical look at how you can learn forward, so to speak. Yeah.
And Stella, did you go to school abroad as well? And
yes, I did. I schooled in Australia. But to answer that question, and based on what I learned in Australia, recently we had a lecture that we gave to the architectural students at University of Kenyatta University. And there's one comment that was given by one of the students after our lecture that has not left me. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about within the curricula. And this student talked about how, if they go back to their home, he was from Western. If he went back and built a structure with, for instance, a timber structure, the traditional African way, a timber structure, and then use mud or cow dung and ash mixture to cover it, he would look like a failure. And within the community he's from, that is not progressive. And that really worried me because that's his culture, that's his heritage. This is where he has come from. So, but in what he's being taught about glass and steel and, all these things that we have brought in that are not necessarily part of our culture. So I think an important aspect would be to really teach who we are first and not make our culture seem backward, because it is not. Yeah, I think that is something that ought to be looked at. What was the pre-colonial architecture and how can we put it in the modern context? Yeah.
No, thank you, Stella. And in fact, then George, I come to you because in your presentation, you are looking at and showing us that pre-colonial heritage is one that was actually very rich in terms of innovations and solutions in the built environment, sustainable solutions, ways of building homes and homesteads and cities that actually spoke to the context, but also spoke to the cultural values that, of course, we held at that particular time. Maybe you can take us through your set of slides, and then I will come back to see how Dr. Opiyo in particular, might respond to what you share in relation to the question of curricula.
Thank you, Joy. My slides are on. I'm just going to look at my topic. Really, there are three parts to it. So I'm going to discuss something about construction materials and systems, not in a very boring way, I hope. Space planning and building, and then pre-colonial cities. And one of the most, I would even say about emphasis in curriculum and even in practice is that we have a very little attention to what we would call our own. For instance, the issue of use of locally available material is always being seen as a, poverty issue, rather than what was available around you and the knowledge that was available for people to be able to build. So that what Stella is talking about is actually being seen as a case of the past and the future. And yet, when it comes to issues of and the environment, I will easily demonstrate that the issue of locally available material is sustainable as opposed to importation of material. When we're looking at, there's this concept of a permanent, a permanent house, a temporary house. This is a very interesting one. When during pre-colonial times, of course, we used to build in a particular way. When the colonialists came, they started building. In fact, if you go and read about the School of Tropical Architecture, which is at the AA School in London, it actually came out of the need of the British to build appropriately in Africa and in the tropics. When they came, they started building their own way. They realized the houses were not livable, so they had to go and research and started a school to train. Now, their houses, which were built permanently out of stone, brick, and mortar, were considered to be modern. And if you look at the way we used to build, which was supposed to be, let me use the term, the Aboriginal term of touching the earth lightly, that your interaction with the ground is at the point where you are not basically doing the excavation, digging deep for foundations and using materials from somewhere else. You are basically growing a house from the ground. And if that house was to die, or you die, it basically becomes one with the soil. This is the kind of thing that during after colonialism, the new Africans who came to work in cities, as she mentioned, go back to the village and they want to build permanent houses. So they start ignoring mud. They start trying to get semi-permanent, the mud and then concrete on top. And then when you get more money, you start importing stones from very far and concrete. The interesting thing about construction, again, is the issue of the gender and workmanship. Most African cultures had, and in fact a lot of them, had women primarily as the builders, like the Maasai and the Matobo women from the Southern Africa part of Zimbabwe. They were able to do this like it was normal to have a woman on a roof building. Right now, it's something, in fact, when I was in school in the early thousands, majority of my classmates were men. There were only about 2 women, actually 3. One of them dropped out along the way. So the issue of women in the construction, is being seen as a man's thing, and yet culturally, it was very obvious, it was very kawaida. And I can tell you, if you go to a site, you find a woman, in fact, go and check a company called Buildex, who are trying to bring women into construction, teaching them craft, let alone design. I'm talking about working, fundi, because the issue is women are being brought into design. We are thinking it's progress. All right? Sorry, did we go? Okay.
You can send it back.
It's okay, that's fine. But the idea is that it's actually retrogressive thinking, that women don't belong in the construction industry. And indeed, most of the women who are in the construction industry are most diligent in terms of workmanship. And because of the issue of ignoring our materials, we have fundis in the rural areas who are busy learning how to use concrete and stone and steel and doing a very terrible job. So if you try to build out of mud and grass, the reason why those buildings look bad It's because there's no good workmanship. There is no good trade. Nobody is doing it better. So it looks bad and it looks ancient. But if you still do it properly, like if you go to Mombasa, I'm sure many of you go to Mombasa and pay top dollar to stay in a nice thatched hut. But when you go back to your village, you think it's backward. And of course, this brings us to the issue of costs. We are looking at a very, very big deficit of millions of houses every year in Kenya, growing by up to 50,000 every year. And even in terms of land ownership, very big majority of Kenya don't own land and cannot even afford building a house. Majority of the buildings are not targeted for the low income, despite the fact that we know that majority of Kenyans live below the poverty line. Why is this so? It's because we used to build for ourselves. You call your relatives, your friends, you choma for them boozy, and they help you build. But right now, if you have to import stone and concrete and cement and ballast and steel and all these mabatis, you need specialist fundis who will charge you a lot of money. And of course, going further into the issue of cities, with the fake real estate values on land, most people cannot afford land. So all this has been brought, in my opinion, and I think I would believe my panelists will agree, because of the issue of that colonization of our mind, that a permanent house is a stone house. I have been to Nyeri and I saw a house that was made of timber in around 1900, still standing there. But if you build with timber at your house, well, as she said, this one is poor. If we look at, for example, the typologies of houses, the issue of just how we used to build, this slide here doesn't even start to do justice to the different types in terms of forms, in terms of shapes of African architecture. It is so rich that if I was to do a slide, I would probably need hundreds of slides just to show the form, the building shape of it. And we were very economical with space. You know, the bigger the house, the more environmental and friendly it is. The more, you know, energy use the building is, the more it interrupts the environment. And we used to do it because we used to spend a lot of time outside. So the idea of a small house was not about poverty. In fact, right now, I think in Western countries, it's becoming a thing to have a tiny home. And we used to do that. So, you know, now, you know, this is just one of the projects I'm trying to do, trying to bring in those things of courtyards and open spaces. But still, it's a challenge because we know at the end of the day, the materials, which are, I would say, very high carbon emissions, and the fact that built environment contributes to about almost 40% of carbon emissions, and up to 30% of the world energy is being used in buildings, all right? Space planning, you know, this is a very old thing we used to do as Africans, courtyards. Right now, it's in fact in school, and Opiyo will tell you, we teach students courtyard design is the in thing. Most cities, this is Kaloleni, what you can see right there. Yes. And you know, the idea of a courtyard, central shared space with houses around it. Most estates which you live in are designed like that. And a lot of cities in Europe have that. You have a street, and then you have a courtyard and a central garden. This is as African as it gets. Let me now conclude my study, my discussion, just going very fast through some cities. I don't want to discuss planning of cities. I just want to mention some of the effects of colonialism. I mean, this is Benin City, the old one that doesn't exist anymore. It only exists in people's imagination because at one point, the city that had been there for hundreds of years, the British had a fracas with the king, and the king killed some of them, and the British sent in a big troops who came in to basically finish and kill the entire civilization that was Benin City. Most of the visitors of these cities at that time came and reported that it was one of the best planned, grandest cities I'd ever seen. Bigger than London, bigger than a lot of the Chinese. Most of the walls they had made out of mud were bigger than the Great Walls of China. And there was a lot of gold. It was a very rich city. On the streets, we were walking with lanterns made of gold. Of course, they demolished everything, and of course, looted all the valuables, which are currently in the British Museum. I think there's a lot of discussions around repatriation, and we've had that. But the worst thing for me is not really about those valuables. It's really these cities that were done long ago that we think being in a city is being modern, it's not. Cities have been there for a long time. And we've as Africans, we planned them very well, even before most Europeans were able to deal with the issues of sanitation that Romanus was talking about here. And other, sort of settlements that were very fortified. There's a lot of evidence, like the Great Zimbabwe ruins, very well planned, great walls up to 11 meters tall, still standing up to today. Interesting thing about this is that when the archaeologists were doing this during the Rhodesian time, the Rhodesian government politically influenced the archaeologists not to say that these were done by the natives. They basically hid that knowledge from the people, and this is a sort of like, of course, you could see subsequent way of trying to demean us as being great builders. This would be the city of, sorry?
Timbuktu.
All right, Timbuktu, sorry, I have terrible eyes. Timbuktu is a sad story of decline. I mean, currently, the last invasion with some Islamists, I think 2018, has really made a big dent on the economics of the city. But this is a city that thrived at its height during the time of the Mali Empire. The richest man who ever lived was the emperor of Mali. This city was the center of art, poetry, and people from all over the world used to come. In fact, if you read about the story of Musa, he created inflation in all the cities he traveled to. One time he was doing a pilgrimage to Mecca. And he was in Cairo, I think, with all his wealth. And the city's wealth plummeted at the value of their money because of how much wealth he had. And unfortunately, most of our cities are full of poor people. But once upon a time, it wasn't.
Ife?
All right. Thank you, Joy. Ife, the interesting thing about it is that it still exists. Unfortunately, the culture has sort of demeaned, and you can see now we're looking at tall buildings, which are the biggest contributors to climate change. The rich cultural life of small buildings is something which has been, over the years, been reduced to rubble. And then this is Kumasi, again in Ghana. What is interesting about Kumasi is that they still have a very rich culture because it's a city that has been occupied all these years. That's a central market in Kumasi, very thriving. And if you look at, for example, the idea that culture and modernism can exist, a city like Kumasi is actually one of those things that we should be looking at. Because as case studies, and I would like to urge Mwalimu here, I also do part-time teaching, just that I don't do history. I teach actually IT, is that we have very good case studies in Africa. The emphasis on African architecture and African material is not as much. So if, for example, we were learning about the city of Kumasi and what has been happening all these years, and yet they still value this city, it's something we need to say that it is possible, and there is no way we can say that modernity must come in, or colonialism must come in to replace African culture. And finally, the Lamu, it's at the eastern coast of Kenya, we know it. It's actually probably the longest continuously inhabited urban area in Kenya for about 700 years, really. And 600 years later, we are having a challenge because the British have come in, actually the Portuguese and the British, I can just say the Europeans in general. Also right now, the biggest fight of survival in heritage is in Lamu. Lamu is mostly a donkeys, it's narrow streets with donkeys being used. Right now, imagine cars couldn't survive in Lamu, but motorbikes have come in. So they're trying to replace donkeys, and there's a fight because a motorbike can go where a donkey can go, all right? And of course, we also know about tourism, what you could see about the new buildings. There's a lot of people from Europe who have made Lamu their home. And there is where you can say, in terms of studies, you can look at the big edge where culture and modernism and what you can call colonialism, the effects of colonialism are right now clashing. And it's a matter of time to see how Lamu survives. It might survive, but the question is, will it survive as an African city, or will it become modernized? Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. Yeah, and a good recognition of that. And I think it's really emphasizing this notion of erasure. These realities, knowledge and information that does not come into our curriculum, that does not come into the education, and therefore are not carried forward into contemporary practice. But I will just skip actually to CAVE, because I know that you have made a big effort and are making a big effort to actually fill in that gap. Mm-hmm. How do we carry forward that research, that knowledge from tradition into contemporary practice? CAVE will share with us, I think, a very exciting approach that they have. They call it the Anthropocene Museum, and some of the various projects that they do within this idea of their research and their work is one which is the Maasai Cow Corridor. And you might wonder, how do we integrate animals and a sort of a very strong traditional life, a way of life into a so-called modern city of Nairobi? And I think we look forward to hearing how you approach these things and how you see their viability and feasibility in the contemporary space. So karibuni.
Thank you, Joy. If the presentation can be loaded. Thank you very much. To begin with, a huge thanks to the British Council, to AWEZA, the lovely host, National Museums of Kenya, for this lovely location. I think we were discussing the fact that it's great that we're out in the wild, as opposed to in a very dark and dingy auditorium. It makes us connect to nature a bit closer. And something we hope to talk about in a bit detail, going back even further from the previous presentation into the inhabitation of caves. And I hope we can indulge us with your ears.
Let us make no mistake, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination. This is taken from the book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable by Amitav Ghosh.
The second quote by Catherine Yusuf. As the Anthropocene proclaims the language of species life, anthropos, through a universalist geologic commons, excuse these big words, but we'll explain, it neatly erases histories of racism that were incubated through the regulatory structure of geologic relations. This is from a book, a brilliant book by Catherine Yusuf, A Billion Anthropocenes, A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or None. Excuse my cave capacity to run a presentation. So welcome to the Anthropocene Museum. It's an institution we've conceived, myself and Stella and team, to consider the new geological epoch that is being proposed to us. An Anthropocene meaning the human being, the age of man, or better, the age of the humans, as geologists are purporting, that we've concluded the Holocene, and now we are in the Anthropocene, which basically means we as humans have affected our biosphere, which is the air, the earth, the water, to such a degree that we have imprints everywhere. And that is what is dictating the so-called age of human beings under the Anthropocene. So we look at the museum and challenge what a museum means for Africans today, and considering that from our own perspectives. So Stella and I, we run the studio, and we really go into caves. This is our point of research as the heritage of the human being, as emerging from caves, the first piece of architecture. And we are not alone. We are a young group of designers, researchers, material analysts, as was previously discussed, to do with traditional materials and what they mean in architecture today. And it's something that we value, to consider this so-called age of man, but from an African perspective. Because we should never forget that why we are here as a human species was very much as a result of the imperialist and colonial efforts that actually resulted in us degrading our environment. And I say us because, with full respect, there were a few white men who decided to split the global south and plunder it in their own means as necessary. And we were at the brunt of it. We were in the mix of being effectively extracted bodies from slavery to being enslaved here in our own land, in our own colonial history. And so we argue, as well as many thinkers argue, this narrative about the Anthropocene ignores that past. This ignores that history, which has to be remembered. And we do that by going into caves, but more so reflecting on the fact that during the 1950s, during the emergency in Kenya specifically, we had the Mau Mau freedom fighters actually using caves as spaces of resistance to have their kamkunjis and meetings to consider what is the African state of the future? Where are we headed? And how can we get rid of the settlers to return back our land? And so this graph quite purely shows the fact that as the great acceleration, which is deemed to be the point when the Anthropocene began, is the very point when the Mau Mau freedom fighters, as well as many other freedom fighters in the global south, were fighting against, so to speak, this age of human beings, but a few human beings, should we say it, in inverted commas. So caves for us are our historical architectural heritage that should never be ignored. And so what we do in a lot of detail is to reflect on the history and how that impacted our cities from a very gridded city, where, as was highlighted in the previous presentation quite beautifully, we had much more inventive ways to actually design the city. But these were plans forced upon us as a people, and today we almost ignore it, like it has always been there. But in actual fact, it was planted. Now, it is a history of struggle which we almost forget was fought also by women and children. This is an artist, Osborne Macharia, who looks at the wives of the Mau Mau as a territory to imagine what that history was and to represent it to the younger generation as critical. And so we look at the museum as well as a territory which we need to question, especially during this time of looking at the restitution of artifacts, which need to be considered, but more so we argue it's the museum that needs to be in question and what the museum means to us as a people, as was highlighted by our brilliant keynote speaker early in the morning. So for us, we present and imagine our histories. We try to represent it through drawings. This is an image of the Turkana people looking at their history of the origin, looking at that very contested territory, looking at the early man, should we say, the hominin. So we try to interpret this history in a lot of detail.
And how we look at that history is by going to various caves around Kenya. We have then, through the Anthropocene Museum, been able to curate 4 of them, and I'll just quickly take you through the 4 Anthropocene museums, so if I could call them. This is the Suswa crater, and this is the first Anthropocene Museum 1.0, as we call it, that we started our research on. And what we do there when we get there, because for us, we argue that a museum should not be housed in a building. The museum is out there in nature. So what we do is we go around this museum. So this particular one in Anthropocene 1.0, we went to Suswa, and we talked to the communities around the caves, and they tell us the challenges that they face. One of the big challenges facing the people in Suswa, obviously, is the extraction of geothermal energy. And with the extraction of geothermal energy, yes, it's green energy, but so much negativity is behind this extraction. There's a lot of people who are displaced from lands that they have inhabited for hundreds of years. There's species of animals and plants that are being depleted because we are trying to get energy from the earth. And with the 1.0, we were very privileged and honored to have it presented at the Cooper Hewitt and Smithsonian Museum in New York, and at the same time running at the Cube Museum in Netherlands. And one of our guides that takes us through in Suswa was telling us about the Vero owl eagle, or eagle owl, that he used to see as a young boy. But that's a bird that's no longer there. He's not seen it for so many years. And that is a direct result of geothermal extraction. And then, of course, in Suswa, we have the baboon parliament. And we look at these spaces. And what we do with them, because obviously we're architects, we turn them into drawings. So what we do is we 3D scan the caves, and then using the point cloud system, we develop drawings out of these caves, scaled drawings, 1-to-1. And then what we did, especially in the New York exhibition, we then 3D printed the cave, got a mold out of it, and then cast it in bronze. And this is the Mbai caves, which you find at Paradise Lost. So this we took all the way to New York. But also we look at the caves and how they relate with architecture. So on your screen, what you see on your left is the baboon parliament, which is in the Suswa caves. And we transpose it with the Pantheon in Rome, and you can see the scale of the baboon parliament and the Pantheon is almost exactly scaled. It's almost as if this architect had been to the baboon parliament and then come up with drawings as an architect. But then for us, architecture, you see, is referenced from nature. We don't just come up with architecture from, yes, a bit from the head, but because of nature and how it influences us as we design. That is Shimoni Caves that we went to in January of 2021. And this was through a commission for a conference that was held in New York as well, the World Around Conference, which took place in January last year in New York. And we did the same as we did with Mbai Caves. And then this was held residence in the Guggenheim Museum for a year. But with like what we do in Suswa, we did the same here at Shimoni. And maybe some of you may know that Shimoni caves are actually slave caves. This was a place where people were held as they waited for ships along the Indian Ocean coast to come down, pick them up, and then take them down to Zanzibar, which was the largest slave market on the east coast of Africa. And then from there, the slaves would be taken to the Middle East, and some would be bought off to work in the spice plantations in Zanzibar. But we also just sit with the community and discuss what these caves mean to them, what the past of these caves are, how they are looking at the caves right now, and what they see as the future of the caves. And we do this for every cave that we visit. And it was quite interesting to find out that despite the fact that within these caves you still see some of the iron rods that were used to hold the slaves, there's still people in the community who completely refuse to accept the fact that slavery happened within these caves. So what then we do, like we did with Suswa, again, is 3D scanned those Shimoni caves, came up with drawings, and in the Anthropocene Museum 3.0, which we named the Obsidian Rain, was exhibited in the 17th Venice Biennale, which just concluded a few months ago. So we had the privilege of having to take the obsidian rain, as we called it. And what that was, we 3D scanned the Mbai caves again, the caves that Kabage was talking about that were used by the Mau Mau freedom fighters. And we then used obsidian rock, which we collected in Gilgil and Naivasha, and used the drawings that we had gotten and hung the rocks in the same shape of the cave, and then took that to Venice. So a space where was a space of resistance by the Mau Mau freedom fighters, we were able to take that space to Venice. And what the idea was to sit down with, panel like this and discuss some of those issues at a global level. But obviously, because of the pandemic, we were not able to do that. So these are some of the drawings that we came up with. So this is a section of the Mbai caves that was temporarily for a few months in Venice. And it was just to experience what the Mau Mau fighters might have been doing within this space. And then in 2021 or 2022, what does this space mean to us now? And we were very fortunate. We were given the grandest space to show our obsidian rain. This is the Galileo Chini Dome within the Giardini. It was a lot of work. Collecting these stones, they are very brittle, they are very sharp. By the time we were working on them, we had lots of cuts, but I think it was worth it to be able to then showcase it in the 17th International Venice Biennale. And these are just images of the rocks. These were 1,683 rocks that we individually drilled, put hooks, and then hang them in the shape of the Mbai caves. And then lastly, this is the one that Joy was talking about, the Masai Cow Corridor, the Anthropocene 4.0. And here we look at the animal husbandry, and this has happened for a very long time. It's not something that is starting now, and of course the Maasai people, this is their way of life. And Nairobi is situated in a place that was historically a place where the Maasai came for cool waters. Actually, that's what Nairobi means, a place of cool waters. So they would herd their cattle across the savannah, and this was a place they came to then, get some water and cool themselves as they moved on to greener pastures. And Nairobi grew from a train depot, really. I don't think it was a planned city. It grew as a depot for the Lunatic Express, as it was coming from Kampala all the way down to the coast. And they stopped here, but then it grew into one of the biggest economic centers for the British colonial government. But with that, it has grown, but we have ignored the fact that this is a place that the Maasai brought their animals. And even today, I am sure you have all you've been in traffic with cows, because this is ancestral places that they have used for a very long time.
Stella, I'm going to race you through that a little bit because we have literally sort of 3 minutes or less. Yeah.
So what we did, we went out into Birika, out in Kajiado, and spoke to these two ladies who remember as young girls grazing cattle across vast lands. But now those vast lands are not there anymore because obviously land has been sold and it's now private land. And they can't graze their animals as they used to. So based on that information, we came up with this, what do I call it? Word, I'll call it a phrase, reverse futurism, where we now look at Nairobi City, We look at the water places that they would come, the cool waters. We look at the road networks. We look at lands that are abandoned. For instance, the land that the airport would be expanding to, the derelict railway lands. These are all places that we think can be used by the Maasai to come and graze their animals. And so what we then did with the caves that we had 3D scanned, we then flipped them so that the vessels, they would hold rainwater vessels and hold water for the Maasai. So this was our proposal that we presented for Dizin as they were turning 15. And what we look at these spaces being spaces integrated within these lands that are not being used currently, the railway lands, the road reserves, and all that. And we create places where the Maasai can come back to the city, water their animals, get veterinary advice or treatment for their animals. And also as a commercial hub, we can have Maasai markets within these spaces. And obviously, you know,
2 seconds.
Right now, okay, the government is doing these road networks, which we think could be used for other things. But I'll quickly talk about BRIT. BRIT.
I think we will move on.
Okay.
Because we are, of course, also virtual, and so there are those who are watching us there. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stella and Kabage. And actually, thank you very much to the panel. I hope that we all recognize that this is a very rich area of discussion. It raises more questions than answers, and that was really what we were trying to provoke. What is pedagogy, then, for future African cities and future contemporary African communities? What is the city, is kind of what we are asking. What is a museum? How do we hold our heritage is also what we are asking. But also, more importantly, what is the episteme? What are the references? What are the sources of knowledge that we can draw on in order to move towards that future? So I'd like to thank George. I'd like to thank Opiyo. I'd like to thank Kabage. I'd like to thank Stella for actually spending some time to give you some insights around this. I know we haven't been able to have a chance to engage with questions, but of course over lunch you can engage them with questions, and now you've been introduced to their ideas. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to the organizers for now. We have a chance for 2 questions. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so let us throw this to the audience. Literally 2 questions, and I had a hand here up first that I saw, and then another one in the back. Are there any women to ask questions? As you saw, women built the world. No women to ask questions? Okay, so we'll have this hand and then the one in the back.
Thank you to the panel. My name is Peter Achayo from African Art Matters. So you've talked about urban planning, and I see Nairobi really in 3 phases historically in terms of the practice. We've got, I'm looking at the last 100, 150 years, say colonial, then maybe what I could call the post-colonial, and then what we have as contemporary. And we have an opportunity right now to redefine how our cities would look like, particularly with the Big 4 agenda, the affordable housing program, which is ongoing. I mean, we're going to see one of the colonial areas in Eastlands being completely demolished to bring up new structures and produce homes in volumes. How are we going to approach this by maybe evolving what I could call a Nairobi aesthetic in terms of design? You know, a lot of what is being talked about is more around function. But how about design, where we can represent our motives, you know, our new values or ways of approaching design? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Peter. And we'll take the second question so that they can respond to them all together. So that one was around the Nairobi aesthetic. It has not been thrown to anybody in particular, but so I will take it through all of you very quickly. And then we have a, yep, so we actually had another hand there. So the gentleman behind you, but I will allow 3 very quickly just because that is a woman. Please make them brief. Yep.
Hello, panel. That was a fantastic conversation, and I really want to congratulate you on just informing us in so many pertinent issues. My comment/question is so I've recently embarked on a project of trying to, in Nairobi, build a house, a 2-bedroom house, using natural, the mud, straw, that whole thing. And I found such resistance, which is putting it very lightly, from the building community who not only finding the workmen and women who are ready to help, but then also finding people who are interested in trying to propagate this. And so my question is, how can we encourage our local builders and our architects and that to celebrate this and to create, it's one thing for me doing it as a passion project, but I find that there's such resistance, almost disdain for it. And this is fantastic to talk about in a symposium, but my question, how do I make this work on the ground with my fundis? What would you advise me?
Thank you. And I'll put that question to you, George, so be ready for that. And then we'll have the very last one. Again, please make them brief.
Thank you for your very candid discussion, very interesting takes from there. My name is Julius Waweru from the Ward Garden and Park. And some of the issues that the gentlemen from CAVE Bureau have brought up, we are actually facing. And the young lady here, I also think she is in our line of dilemma. Now we have a park, we are putting together a community park whose fundamentals are in conservation, health and wellness, and fostering community. Now, you were talking about traditional methods of construction. We are exploring arbotecture, and there is a trend in some of the European countries with a view to averting climate change, something called biobotanics, which is construction through living trees. We are exploring that at our park. Do you think that that is also a way that we can look at construction in the future? Or is it sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's look at those. Yep.
I may share one question from
Yes,
the online
please
audience.
do.
From Agan Odero. He says, amazing work with caves and the architectural reconstructions and reimaginations. Great to know that our work is being seen in places like New York and in Venice. Can we see it locally as well?
Okay, so that was an easy one. Can we see this locally? So maybe we start there, and if I can ask Cave to respond to the two questions. One, of course, very directly, how can the work that you're doing be seen locally? Is it available to be seen locally? But I think to also respond to this question of beginning to develop an aesthetic that expresses our own sensibilities of beauty and things like that. So the question was, can we move away from functionality, and what does the aesthetic look like? And then the question I will put to you, Opiyo, is the question that is coming from the gentleman who asked the third question, is to what extent can policy respond to traditional practices of building? To what extent can we look at standards and policy that is responding to that? Because we know that that is going to be a challenge, of course, if you're trying to build something like that in the city of Nairobi. Can we build out of mud and wattle? Questions around fire safety and so on. And then, George, the Architectural Association of Kenya, of course, I'm assuming, promotes and celebrates our architectural heritage. I think the question that came in around the challenge of trying to get artisans, but also just a recognition and a celebration of our heritage. To what extent do you think the Architectural Association can be a propagator and a promoter of that particular practice that is happening among members of the community and that particular desire that you're seeing among members of the community? So Cave first.
Okay, I'll answer the easy one, then Kabage can answer. A lot of those exhibitions we have been invited to exhibit, and would be very happy to do the same here. Our Venice exhibition is on its way back. It's in the high seas right now, and we are currently trying to think of where here. If the museums of Kenya invite us, we'll bring it here. But yeah, yes, definitely we would like to do it and showcase our work in Kenya as well.
Thank you, Joy, for that question. I think it's a very difficult question to do is aesthetic, because sometimes we get muddled in styles. As designers, what is important to realize is that the consumption of styles has been very much been a foreign product or foreign perception. If you imagine your ancestors, your grandparents, they didn't talk about styles. They talked about concrete things like making. What material are you going to use? This space, what does it need? You know, and I think in a way we've lost that contact with our material connection. And going back to the question of, I think, the materials, not to answer it for our other panelists, I think it's at the heart of that, you know, where we've lost that value system to look at these aesthetics, you know, of the things around us that should mean everything to us. But we're relying on either Pinterest or other, you know, medias out there to tell us what is important, what is trending. And I think we need to grow into that attitude to value our own aesthetic that then now opens up our imagination to things beyond style. And I think that's something we try to embody. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thinking beyond style. Dr. Opiyo.
Thanks, Joy. I think to what extent the policy can help us to appreciate the traditional building material. I think one major opportunity is having co-created policy which are driven by the users, because at times we stand back. For example, if you are called to come and give your opinion about a draft policy, you find very few people create time to go and give their opinion. So I think we need to value this, to go and co-create and give our ideas in terms of our experience as architects, and even as users. You don't need to be a professional just to know how our building should accommodate to your needs. I think the issue of co-created is very important, and also citizen science, empowering citizens also to come out to give their views about these standards, because the building codes are British building codes, which are not fit for Kenyan environment. So how do we ensure that we inform this? So that's the major way of doing this. I think I just want to comment on Peter's concern about the opportunities also to embrace and to improve our living environment. I think he referred to the regeneration project for the Eastlands. I think it's a perfect opportunity, Peter, for people to see how do we also contribute, because the proposals are there, but to what extent are we also bringing our knowledge as people who are experts in culture, people who are experts in sociology and others, so that we are able to make this thing more functional, and also to pick the aesthetic concerns which have been raised by members here. Thank you.
So clearly one of the things that education needs to look at is this question of the building code.
Yes.
Yeah. George, and maybe you can also then encourage and try and see how do you encourage those who have an interest to build in this sort of traditional local way. How can that be encouraged?
Let me start with a very interesting story of a client I had in Siaya who we discussed about building with brick, and when he went to start building, his fundis and neighbors told him he's too big a man to build using matope. And that ended the story about brick, and he went all the way to Kedoa, which is very far from Siaya, for those who know, to bring in a stone to build with. Also, let me say there's a statistic that you need to know. The reality is that majority of Kenyans build for themselves, do not involve professionals. Up to about 80%. I would say every 10 buildings, 8 of them you see, even in Nairobi, do not involve professionals. What does this say? There is the issue of costs, and then there's the issue of client but particular peculiarities, because we don't think, for example, professional input is something you want to spend money on. So for me, I would like to encourage the self-built people, especially the bold ones, because I am not so much interested in the ones who build typically because I'm saving money, I don't want to pay an architect. I am interested in those who build by themselves because they cannot get an architect to do it for themselves. You could also go and read about Geoffrey Bauer, a Sri Lankan architect, who basically couldn't get someone to build what he wanted. And it stopped. He actually, at 38, a lawyer practicing, went back to school, studied architecture so he can build for himself. What I'm saying is that if you look at what Cave presented, we are all architects. If anything, the cave was the original appropriation of space by human beings for use. So typically, we should be able to build for ourselves. And I would say that as an association, we try to promote excellence in the built environment, and we are guided by the building code, for example, which is very much skewed towards what we'll call contemporary materials. The British Code talks about construction of using concrete, steel, and everything. So we can only break this mold when we get a few bold clients who are firm enough to insist on a particular material, because it is your project. The job of an architect or other designers is to visualize your dream. So if you get an architect discouraging you from using mud because they think it's backward, you should drop them and get someone else, all right? So finally, I want to look at the issues of cost. The reality of the matter is that the reason why majority of Kenyans cannot afford to build, it's because the materials are very expensive and land is expensive. So is it possible that the reason why we don't have good design is because people are being misguided because they're thinking they're saving money? And it's also very possible that if we decide to look at this locally available material, we should not look at them just as a piece of art. It is not culture, it is beyond culture. It is an issue of, can I manage to do that? Because even people who live in Kibera right now in the urban areas, most of their buildings cannot be approved. And yet we have millions of people living in informal settlements in mud buildings. So the idea of a building code, and I like what Romanus Opiyo said here, that we need to engage as a community. Because if we assume, for example, the building code is a preserve of the built environment, architects and planners and these other guys, they're only thinking about the cost of the project and how much money they can make as from consultants. But if the community engages and says, for example, we can use cow dung as a preservative in our building, I think it can be put in the building code and then it doesn't become illegal. But the reality is that it's still being used. It's just that it's not approved. So I would say that I would encourage those who are building boldly to come forward and hopefully get architects like Cave Bureau and some of us who are open to see how we can achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like us to appreciate Stella Mutegi, Kabage Karanja, Romanus Opiyo, and George Arrabu. Thank you all very much, panelists. Thank you very much, audience, as well. Thank you.